Okay, I want to talk about flow charting and specifically flow charting for programming. So I want to explain what flow charting is or why it's used, and then we'll get into exactly how to do it, what the symbols mean. A couple reasons to do flow charting. One is to break a program down step by step. So I'll give you an example. When you're thinking about writing a program that's going to calculate a monthly payment. You might think, okay, the step required is take whatever the amount is and divide it by 12. But if you start to think about the actual steps involved, you might realize, well, before we do that, we probably need to add interest or calculate interest, and then add that to the amount. So now we already got 2 or 3 steps in what sounds like just a one-step process, right? Just taking something and dividing it by 12. And in addition to that, you might have to get the original amount. So you might have to get some input first, then calculate the interest, then add it to the amount, then divide it by 12, then output that. So then you've got 4 or 5 steps at least. So that's the idea behind flowcharting, is figuring out all the steps, and sort of as you do that, it might reveal what steps you missed, what additional steps you need. The other thing you're going to run into with flowcharting, or another reason why people do it, is before you start just trying to jump right into writing the code, right? So instead of trying to immediately start writing code in Java or PHP, if you flowchart it first, you can identify all the things you need to do, and then when you write the code, you can just execute the steps required that you figured out in your flowchart. So that's kind of a general overview of what flowcharting is, but in order to understand it, we need to start with the basics, and that is understanding the symbols. So I'm going to try to go through 3 of the most common symbols and the most basic symbols in this video. We'll learn more about the logic, the syntax in future videos. So the first symbol I want to talk about is this termination symbol. It's just a little cylinder looking thing, right? So that's the termination symbol. What it's used for, or how it's used, is it's going to signify the beginning and the end of your program. So if somebody came and looked at this flow chart, they'd know exactly where it started and where it ended. So to use that termination symbol, you always want to put either the word start or stop in there. Those are the only 2 things you're going to see in a termination symbol. And while we're talking about that, it's important to learn the proper syntax. So typically your start and your stop are sort of keywords that are going to go in all caps. So notice if you're flowcharting properly, you will have a termination symbol, you will have the word start or stop in it, and it will be in all caps. Very straightforward. Let's talk about this next symbol, which is I put it next because typically you're going to have to get input before you start trying to do processes. So when you're doing processes, we'll talk about that in a moment, but this parallelogram thing is used for input and output. So if you're trying to get something from the user or you're trying to display something back out, those steps should go in an input symbol. So going back to the example about calculating a monthly payment. Notice if we need to get that amount first, we have an input statement. So we know that this step is getting something from the user, in this case, something called amount owed. So the way the input-output works, if you're getting something from the user, you have to do keyword read, and then whatever you're trying to get. Here's another example. Here we're getting 2 things. We're getting the name and the age. age. So we have all caps read, followed by 1, comma, 2, comma, as many things as you're trying to get or get input from the user. So if we need to get name, address, age, and salary, we would just put those things after the read keyword, separated by commas. I'll talk more about these, what are called variables, in another video as well. So as we see more examples of these, I'll reiterate some of the syntax. So if you're getting something, you want to do read. If you're printing something back out, like in that monthly payment thing where we divided it by 12, notice typically the read statement is going to go first, and then the write's going to go at the end. So notice here I've got a write, meaning I'm going to output something, and then just whatever you might want to output. So I've got all caps write, and then a variable that's going to have the monthly payment in it. So that's output versus input, and those are the two things you're going to use that parallelogram symbol for. Okay, so terminations at the beginning and the end. Anytime you're getting something or displaying it back out, you would have the read write or input output symbol. Again, the syntax on that is all caps read or write, and then as many things as you want to output or input can be separated by commas. So if we wanted to output the user's name and their age in months, we could have write name, comma, age in months. So those are the first two symbols. A lot of the other sort of internal steps, the processes, the calculations, the things that your program is doing will go inside a process symbol, which is just a rectangle. So each of these symbols means something, and then like you saw, the syntax of using them is important as well. So a rectangle just signifies some step that the program's doing. Let's go back to this example. So we got the amount owed, and like I mentioned before, we probably need to calculate interest, then add that back to the total, then divide all that by 12. So I've broken that down into 3 separate processes. And the way the process symbol works is you would just put your step, your calculation, your whatever the work that your program is doing in that particular step just goes inside that rectangle. So again, I'm not going to get too deep into the syntax in this video, but in future videos we'll talk about the logic and the syntax in more detail. But notice in this one we have amount owed here that we just got from the user. So now we got a second, what's called a variable, and we're just going to say, okay, let's take that amount owed, multiply it by 5.9%, which is 0.059, put that in the interest. Then in a separate step, we would take that interest, add it to the amount owed, maybe put that in a total. So each of those processes are just steps that the program needs to do to arrive at whatever it's trying to arrive at. Here's another example, pretty straightforward one. We got their age. We multiplied it by 12 to get how many months old they are, and then we just output that. So that's just a pretty straightforward one where you have one process before you do your input-output. So that's a quick intro into what these symbols mean, the syntax of them, and what they're used for. But in future videos, we'll talk about specific examples of additional syntax that you definitely need to know as you do flowcharting.